My journey in this work started already in 1998, 1999. I was, as a young doctor in that time, finishing my specialization in Albania, and I started to work in refugee camps with people of Kosovo who were escaped due to the atrocity in Kosovo, human losses and torture. And then I met children who were without parents, people who were wounded, parents without children, people who didn't know what's happened with their dearest one. But the most painful one, it was when I met survivors of sexual violence. Why? Those women were silent. They were so ashamed, they were unable to speak. They just asked me to provide some support because some of them was bleeding. The torture was not only psychological, it was also physical. They had scars in their body. So as a young doctor, I was trying to support them, send in some kind of ambulance in the camps, just to support them in a way. Of course, I was not prepared to deal with that collective trauma of my nation, but as a young doctor, I was trying to do my best. But soon I understand that my role as a doctor in the setup of camps, it's out of the, I cannot really play a role of gastroenterologist. So I start to support them with medical support, healing through listening to them, sending to those polyclinics, trying to find family members because some of them, they didn't have the family members around. And in this way, I realized that whenever I will come in Kosovo, I have to establish a center when those women and girls will feel safe to have some treatment, to be listened carefully, and to not be prejudiced, but to give unconditional love because they missed that support from family, from community and society at all after the wartime. Yes, indeed, in 2014 we reached to recognize them by laws, but implementation of this law started in 2018. In Kosovo, after the war, and also in other societies after the wartime, we had a lot of glorification about the war values, while people who died, people who fight, missing people, invalids, veterans, they had it name and surname. Society was proud with their contribution, while this part of society who was really terrified during the wartime was most invisible pain in our society. The crime of rape in a war circumstances, it's done in that way in order to let survivors silent. They take autonomy of your body and your mind. It's not so easy to continue your life later on, especially if you are also stigmatized and prejudiced in your society. It's much better to cope in silence and be isolated in the family rather than to seek support or be public. Therefore, after the wartime, I think as a society we failed to support and provide them adequate support. As an NGO, we was trying to work completely in a hiding way because we had it also other war torture categories benefiting from our program. They had it open door to come to us, but we were allowed to share in the media. We were not allowed to bring in public the story because stigmas around this crime, it was so higher, which prevent them to also come to our organization, but also to seek for other rights. So for 15 years, we had to fight with our institution in order to create the space that those survivors to be recognized by law. In 2014, finally, survivors of sexual violence were recognized by law, and 4 years later, we start to implement that law. But we had it in this period of time also to work closely with our institution in order to establish certain principles, certain guidelines, how to recognize this crime and those survivors after 15 years, which was not such an easy procedure. But finally in 2018, we start to have first survivors who become recognized from a state institution and they start to get a monthly pension. This amount of money is not that it's changing their life, but it is recognition of their suffering, and this is so important for survivors' life. It is validation of their past, because in society when everybody questions your past and you are shamed and blamed for the crime, it is so important state to be there to show support and to recognize your pain. Therefore, when this schema was introduced in our society, it was kind of social justice for survivors, for their family, and they become empowered then further to enter in other process as asking for justice through the criminal procedures. I think this nomination, for me, it was a victory not for myself and my team who are working tireless during those 25 years, but it was showing the recognition and acknowledgement of resilience of 1,100 survivors who worked with us, who trust us, who were healed and cried together with us. So for me, this nomination is the biggest honor that institution could do to one individual or to an organization. But for me, it was important that we brought it Kosovo in the map, that crime happened, because from a neighbor's country, those crimes were denied. And it was so important that those crimes now are recognized also through this nomination. With Ukrainian survivor, I already started my cooperation on 2019. It was a group of survivors of Ukraine who already visited Kosovo in that period of time with idea to exchange, to establish cooperation. We, both of us, neither Ukraine, neither us, we didn't know that after 1 or 2 years the war will start again there. So we had a big plan. We had a big plan to establish support and to transfer know-how of KICT in Ukraine. Of course, after the war started, those kind of cooperation were intensified, and we started to work both with journalists, with state institution, with the civil society, as well as survivors. My first contact with journalists, it was when the Association of Kosovo Journalists brought in the journalists from Ukraine in Kosovo. And for me, knowing the perspective and working in the refugee camps, I know that those journalists, they are human beings. They are impacted from the war. They left the family members there. Who knows what's happened with their families? So the psychology must be very heavily related with their family. And we try to support them, to offer them some support. But we identified that those journalists didn't have it only capacity to write on paper. They had it artistic capacities. They had it painting capacities. And we tried to work with them in different dimensions. But as well as our role as a civil society was to train them and prepare them with the capacity. So whenever they are in Ukraine, they will be the main allies of survivors, because it is so important media to be surrounding this group. In Kosovo, we work with the media after the wartime, but of course, experience was not present. So therefore, the experience built in Kosovo has to go in Ukraine, because survivors needs you as a journalist there, needs your support. No matter if stigma is present in different format, it is there, because it have to do with your integrity. It's self-stigma about what's happened to you. So those women need to speak up, need to be supported, need to not be harmed during those interviews, need to have sensitive approach towards them. So therefore, we thought that working with journalists is investing on tackling stigma in Ukraine society. Then we started with NGOs. With NGOs, we had a different dimension. We had it MOUs, we had it exchange in different forums. Unfortunately, I was invited physically to go many times in Ukraine, but due to the circumstances and the war, I was able only on electronic way to be present in Ukraine, but I was in many forums. We met also different people from ministries, from institutions, from gender equality, just to bring the perspective of Kosovo and to not repeat the same mistake we did here. Besides lesson learned, it is so important also some kind of mistake we missed here. For example, documentation in Kosovo we missed after the wartime. So I was strong advocate to address to them that documentation have to be on time, on a real time, and thanks God that you have a state present there, you have international support. So proper documentation with psychosocial support integrated, it is so important for any initiative you might take, from a rehabilitation, from a treatment, from reparation, from access to justice and establishing the truth. I think if you have a good documentation, will serve also for the next generation to learn what's happened during the current situation now that Ukraine is going on. Indeed, in our history, before we brought its survivors in the public due to the stigma and prejudice, we tried to bring those history through the books. And it was another way to bring the truth in the surface. The first book was dedicated to the woman's story, I Want to Be Heard. Second book was dedicated to the male story, but also dimension of the family. And third book, it was dedicated to male survivors. When I was discussing with our expert organization there, we decided which will be the format of the book that you would like to share it in your society. And to me, I think it was a brave selection and decision, because they chose it, the book, second book, Beyond the Pain Towards the Courage. Why it is so important? Because this book, it brings in the focus also dynamic of trauma in a family, not only survivors' consequences, but also dynamic of the family. I have to say that in Kosovo we saw that not only survivors is suffering from PTSD, depression and other psychological and mental issues, but also family are part of this suffering because they were present during the time when the dearest one were raped. So it was such a right choice to raise awareness in Ukraine and to bring some attention also to the family, because they are completely in shadow. Nobody is discussing about them. So for me it was a great choice, but we are very open for other possibilities and opportunities to cooperate with Ukraine organization. It's not only Russian propaganda. All perpetrator side, all those enemies, they use this weapon, the most dirty weapon and cheap weapon, as an integrated arsenal in the war. In the way as they do, they let survivors silent just to not speak up. And if we are not promoting the story and if we are not fighting for justice, we somehow implement strategy of perpetrators. And we know the strategy. They deny the crime. They don't want to admit the crime. But we as activists, it's our mission, our obligation to bring the story in the surface, to empower survivors to seek justice in order to shame and blame those who are accountable for this crime, not survivors. And I have to say we have to do that together, because also those days Serbia is denying in the same way. They don't want to recognize the fact. If you do not recognize the truth and the past, you never ever could build your future. And I believe that Ukraine now is doing a great job through supporting survivors to go in justice, documenting those kind of story, and the story will shame Russia with all those kind of atrocities that they are doing on innocent people, on innocent women and children who are unprotected. And we have to fight for that, because we know that enemy always deny. They kill, massacre, torture, rape, and deny in the end. They do not. They do that with a purpose. It's a race strategy, but we have to find a strategy in order to diminish those kind of propaganda, and we can do that only through empowering those voices to speak up and be part of the justice process and bring them behind the bars.